I think that one of the myths that international schools sometimes adhere to is the idea that the target language, and we must recognize that international schools can have many target languages, English, Chinese, there could be European schools whose target language is French. So when we center the language and that language of instruction as being the only conduit for cognitive development or learning, because we think more is better. We think the more exposure multilingual learners have to those languages, the better, the faster they will learn it. There is enough language acquisition research out there that shows that actually learning languages is a cognitive process, not a linear binary process.
Okay, welcome back to the Education Vanguard. Today we're joined by Ceci Gomez-Galvez, a dedicated collaborator, coach, and advocate in the field of multilingual education. Ceci is a leader in translanguaging pedagogy, culturally responsive practice, and equitable access. She's an innovator who empowers fellow educators to integrate digital tools and 21st century skills to enhance learning across all divisions. With her core belief that educators must be advocates for all students, she works tirelessly to ensure schools provide truly inclusive learning experiences. Ceci and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm pleased to count her not just as a collaborator, but also as a friend, and also somebody who's probably brought me into places, post junk at 21C conferences. I seem to recall some very expensive karaoke bills last year, Ceci. We won't get into that in today's conversation. We'll keep it serious, but it's wonderful to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Justin. And karaoke's always worth it, by the way, to everybody who's listening. And it is such an honor to be invited to be part of this podcast. I think there are so many opportunities for us to share our voices, and I cannot think of a better one that targets the audience that I really would like to hear the message of my work more than 21st century. So, Justin, it's an honor for me to be here.
All right, thanks, Ceci. All right, now that we're done with boosting each other up, we can get into having a conversation. I thought we'd start out with, I mean, you've got a great social media profile, and everyone knows you, but it'd be great to sort of, if you could just give it a little bit of background to who you are,
Mhm.
where you're from, how you came into education, and so people have the context.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've been in education since I was 16 years old. I don't know if many people know that, but I started teaching English in Guatemala, my home country. I'm from Guatemala City. I was born and raised in Guatemala, educated in Guatemala. My primary language is Spanish. And I started teaching when I was 16, when I was so young, after going to teach lessons after school to kids. I was teaching in a children's program at the time because I was fluent in English. And that's because my parents sacrificed so much to send me to a private bilingual school in Guatemala, which gave me the fluency in both Spanish and English that I have today. And part of the reason why I do the work that I do today is because of my background as a bilingual and multilingual individual. And so you said a lot of people know me. I love that you say that. I love that people know this version of me, but where I come from and the roots of where I come from really is what fuels the Ceci that people get to meet today.
That's really wonderful. I actually didn't know that. And the when you started doing that at 16, how soon into that did you feel like, oh, this is what I want to do, be an educator?
At the time, I was doing it out of need. I had to get a job after school to help my family out financially. And I went to this language school in Guatemala where my mom actually said, why don't you go and take a couple of courses so you can keep your English, which resonates a lot with the parent communities that I work with. I don't want you to lose that. I don't want you to lose your fluency in English. And then when I went to get an admissions test for this place, they said, well, actually, you're pretty fluent. And we were wondering if you would like to teach here because we are very low on teachers who are fluent and know the language the way that you do. I knew it academically as well, not just socially. And so I said, I don't know if I can have a job. And I remember typing in an actual typewriter my first CV, my first resume, and it had like my school where I had graduated from or was about to graduate from, and then I didn't have anything else. It was like 3 lines, 3 bullet points, and that's what I gave for my first CV. So when I started in this work, I didn't really choose it. It chose me. And I feel that for many years in my career, I wondered 10 years into teaching. I was living in Italy when I was about 25, 26 years old. And I had been teaching and working for 10 years. And I asked myself, is this what I want to do? Is this what I want to do? Or is this what I was meant to do? Or is this what life has chosen for me? And I think in that exploration of self is that I found that about me, that languages are levels of identity. And that's where I really got to the heart of the work that I do today, is when I looked inward and I was like, do I love this? Yes. Why do I love it? Why do I love advocating for multilingual learners? Why do I love exploring the levels of communication through language and culture? And so then I was like, I'm going to ride this train for as long as it lets me. And here I am.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you go from, being a teacher and I mean, a very young age, right? Like,
Yeah.
8 years before a lot of people, if they go
Yeah.
through the kind of traditional pathway, would do it. And now you're a real leader in the field. I wonder actually, I have this theory that if people get the reps in earlier in their career, if you're doing something really when you're really young, either in high school or right out of high school, then you have in a way a kind of advantage over other people, right? Because you've just been doing it for longer. I don't know if you've ever reflected on that.
I definitely have later on in my life. I think when I was younger and I wasn't, like you said, like a lot of people start their teaching careers in their mid 20s. And I remember meeting people in my second international school where I worked in Milan who were about the same age as I was, or maybe a little bit older, and were just fresh out of university. They had just started teaching. And I had been teaching whilst going to university. So I was doing both of those things. My practice teaching was actually done through the work that I was already doing. And so I think that meeting people in like their first years of teaching and me having taught in so many different areas, like I taught children in a language school, I had also taught adults, I had taught business English. I had also was teaching Spanish at the time as I was an MYP language B teacher. So I was also teaching Spanish at that. So all of these different levels, it sparked for me that idea of building teacher capacity through other people's experiences. Instructional coaches or people who worked in professional development. I started getting really interested in how do you build teacher capacity so that what you're doing in your classroom that you know is great, that you know is having really good impact on student learning, whether it's in their data or in their sense of belonging, how do you start sharing that? And I think that's where really I started thinking about this experience that I had in this story of starting really young, but also being able to make mistakes really young. I think that's something that I don't talk about enough because I was a kid. And so there were a lot of things that I was unafraid to try and I was unafraid to do because I was young, that now when I reflect on it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I don't know that I would have been able to take those innovative risks when I was older and I was trying to secure a job and a career. And I think that's part of the domino effect of what has not built that confidence in me of being able to support others through a journey of education and teaching, especially in international schools, because of the different perspectives that we bring to this work.
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think you've sort of already answered the question I was going to go to next by the conversation we just had. But you talk on your website, and I know it's a big belief for you and centers in you about the responsibility of schools and educators to be advocates for all students around multilingualism. Is there a specific experience in the past that really solidified that for you, or is it more just your experiences over the years?
It is a million small moments, right, that have led it's what I love this book Street Data. I'm blanking right now on the authors of Street Data, but I love these little pieces of stories and experiences that you gather that you can't see on a data sheet or that you can't necessarily quantify, but this qualitative data that tells you that what you're putting into practice when you center the human beings in the room is really going to yield really good results in just lifelong learning. And so I can't really think of one specific example, but now that in my role as the coordinator of an EAL program, I get to work with adults a lot. So hearing them their stories of how they are applying the approaches and how they are shifting mindsets to more an asset-based mindset, to the teachers that they work with, to the adults that they work with, even sometimes to our parent community who are still learning how language acquisition and identity are all blended into one. I think the biggest form of pride and evidence that I have of this work is seeing other teachers empowered and just finding that joy in teaching because of the approaches of leveraging that multilingualism in students. And I believe it's been called like the magical moments in my classroom. I think it's been referred to more as magical moments rather than, oh, look at all this data too, and how students are leaning in to their learning is massive. But it is those moments where it's like the human beings in the classroom are feeling that joy as well, both teachers and students alike. I think those are the magical moments really that make my work feel so rewarding and so true to to the belief and that real and true stance of centering our multilingual individuals as both unique and full of magic.
That's really a nice way to put it. My impression is that, the conversation around multilingualism in education has really expanded in recent years, and more schools are taking this seriously and working with people like yourself as a consultant to really look at it. But I'm sure that there's a ways to go and on this road as well. And so I wonder if you could just sort of help center people, and maybe this question might help with that initially, which is what are some of the big misconceptions schools have with regard to multilingual learners, and maybe explore that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think the greats like Dr. Virginia Rojas, who is a mentor of mine, or Dr. Ofelia Garcia, who is one of the trailblazers in translanguaging work, or Dr. Andrea Honesfeld, who centers the work around multilingual learner success within the collaborative structures of schools. I think that one of the myths that international schools sometimes adhere to is the idea that the target language, and we must recognize that international schools can have many target languages: English, Chinese, there could be European schools whose target language is French. So when we center the language and that language of instruction as being the only conduit for cognitive development or learning, because we think more is better. We think the more exposure multilingual learners have to those languages, the better, the faster they will learn it. There is enough language acquisition research out there that shows that actually learning languages is our cognitive process, not a linear binary process, where even though all of our progression rubrics show a growth in progress when we're assessing students in any kind of language acquisition, I think what we miss is that it actually cycles back in, and language learning in blending with culture and in learning experiences, all of that matters for language acquisition. So I think that sometimes in international schools, we might have this idea that having English only or having one monolingual mindset in a classroom is going to support multilingual learners in learning that language more efficiently and better. And within that myth, I think we miss the opportunity of leveraging students' multilingual and multicultural identities as a conduit for learning, as a conduit for their success as whole people, rather than asking them to leave those parts of themselves at the door for the sake of learning a language better and stronger and more accurately. And so I think that's a myth that it continues to prevail. I also think that the optics of this myth are also important. Our parent community sometimes might think that watching their children engage only in one language, it's, oh, that means that they're learning it. That means that they're acquiring it. That means it means all of these things. And I think that myth of that language acquisition doesn't work that way necessarily. And I know for a fact it didn't work that way for me. And so for me to be able to be the ambilingual that I am now, I can language both Spanish and English equally. I had to be exposed to both, and I had to be able to build bridges between both of those languages in order for me to make sense of both of those worlds, both linguistically and culturally. So this myth of more is better and like that erasure of other languages to give space to just one, that's not the way that our brains work. That is not the way the bilingual or multilingual brain works. And I would hope that there is also a shift in perspective to be able to see language learning as more of a holistic and whole experience rather than a linear and monolingual way to look at the process of learning language.
That's great. Could you give a, I mean, give a concrete example maybe of like what does this look like in practice, right? Because I can definitely envision the school that you're talking about where it's like more is better. We want, I send my kids to the school to speak English, not
Yes.
Chinese or whatever the other,
Yeah.
the host language of the school is. So what does it look like in practice to kind of respect the students' home language
Yeah.
and bring these other elements into it and not be, monomaniacally focused on the
For
target
sure.
language, as you say?
I think the not the easy answer, but I think the immediate answer that comes to mind obviously is translanguaging pedagogy, which is the idea. The pedagogy really is it comes in three different phases, like the stance of believing that multilingualism is an asset. So when you are a teacher who builds a translanguaging culture in your classroom, that means that you are going to see your multilingual learners as them bringing something to the table of learning because they're multilingual learners, because they have connections to other languages and other cultures that they bring to the learning, and which just invites inquiry and invites students a sense of discovery and curiosity, and also a connection, a cognitive and an emotional connection to learning, an authentic connection to learning. And then there's also translanguaging pedagogy talks about the design for translanguaging and also the shifts and those moves that teachers make in order to welcome that use. So, a very simple example, but a concrete one, is fostering metalinguistic awareness. If you are looking at grammar structures with your students and you want to dissect a sentence because of a specific structure, let's say past tenses. Past tenses in English can be complex. There are regular and irregular verbs. There are also different types of past tenses depending on the time frame that you're speaking of. In other languages, past tenses may not sound like that. They may not look like that. And so, inviting students to look at a sentence in English and asking them in their home primary dominant languages, how does that sentence sound? What does it look like? What are the structures of this sentence in other languages? It can give students that bridge that I was talking about before, that bridge of, oh, so when you say past tense, you mean this, because in my primary language, it sounds like this, it doesn't sound like this, but now I understand what that means to speak in past tenses and why it changes this way in English and why it's this way in my primary language. And actually, my buddy here, like my partner, my writing partner, he speaks another language and it sounds different in his. So when I'm revising and editing his writing and we're doing writing partners, I'm going to look out for those errors he might make because in his language it sounds like this. So he might make those errors. So those I guess that awareness as well of creating those moments and those spaces for students to be able to do that, for students to be able to think of their primary language as a blueprint of something that will help them make sense of another language. I think just giving that space, it doesn't mean that teachers have to speak everybody's languages. I think that's one of the common, again, misconceptions about the invitation of multilingualism in your classes. I don't speak all those languages. How am I going to know that my kids are not using language in the wrong way or incorrectly? But really, it's the invitation to inquire around, oh, this looks like this because it's like this. And we do that in other forms of learning experiences. So language is just one of them. We don't need to know them in order to give students the opportunity to build that metalinguistic awareness and to have that relationship with their primary language as something that they can leverage in our classrooms versus something that they shouldn't think about because they have to focus only on one language.
Yeah, I mean it's a little bit of a zag, but I wonder it's a hard thing for schools to address, I think, but I presumably would be better for schools to have more multilingual teachers on staff, I would have thought, right? I mean, even just from a pure modeling standpoint. I mean, I think about that as a parent, right?
Sure.
I'm trying to raise a multilingual children, but I myself am monolingual. I mean, I reflect on that often, and I think from a school standpoint, it would presumably be good to have more multilingual teachers that are openly multilingual as well.
You know what, Justin? I feel like international schools have a multilingual community already. The teachers themselves don't need to be multilingual to be able to model this for students. But when you think about the parent community, our parent community is predominantly, if not all, multilingual. And I feel I get asked this all the time as a consultant, as the coordinator of our program, like the partnerships between teachers, between the school and parents. And I feel like the leveraging of the multilingualism expertise of parents, I think that's part of the thing that we're missing because we can have those models. Our teachers don't need to be multilingual. We also have our local staff members in international schools that speak the host country language fluently and academically. And so I think that it's that, again, we go back to building those bridges. I feel like there's those connections that sometimes we miss because we're not asking the right questions. When we ask the questions about students developing their language skills, I think we immediately think monolingually. We say, oh, I want my child to develop their language skills. But some deep part of them is saying in English. But what we really should say is how do we develop our students' language skill set as a whole? And if we did that and we considered our students as multilingual learners first, before learners of English or learners of French or learners of some language of instruction, if we consider them as multilingual, then the opportunities for us to say, whoa, we can have language clubs. We can have bilingual read alouds when we invite parents. We can have our local staff members model. Right now my brain immediately goes into the all of those ideas, and that's the kind of work that I love doing with schools as well, is to come up with that. If we were to ask the question this way, what are the entry points for us to really develop true global citizens that leverage their multilingualism and multiculturalism for the betterment of the world? Because ultimately that's what we want our kids to do. We want our kids to
Yeah.
be good, have a good impact in the world and in who they are. And all international schools, I think, have global citizenship somewhere in their ethos and in their mission statement. And so the question really is not how do we make them better speakers of one language, but how do we make them multicultural, multilingual individuals that can have a real impact. And you, as a parent as well, I'm thinking about the parents too. I want parents in our communities to feel empowered, not to feel left out of the learning process. And whether parents are monolingual, multilingual, I want parents to feel that they have a direct impact in the learning of language and development of their children. And sometimes schools might give the impression that if they don't speak the language of instruction, they can't participate in that part of their learning and development for their kids. And I want to have a different conversation around how our parents, our multilingual community itself, can be a model, and we can leverage that as a true partnership with the learning of the students in our international schools.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that you're really talking about a school as a whole ecosystem, right? It's not teacher by teacher. It's
That's
like
right.
where are there talents? Where are there things that we can
Hmm.
leverage? Whether it's in the parent community, support staff
That's right.
community, host teacher community. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that you've touched on that I'd like to explore more is this concept that we're in international schools, we're multilingual communities, multilingual families, etc. We're also multicultural. So can you explore a little bit more about this interplay between culture and language and how that, informs this term culturally responsive teaching?
For sure.
What does that mean in practical terms for, a high school math teacher, let's say?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, high school math teacher, I think it's a quick answer is that math is learned differently in different cultures. And when we have a multicultural classroom, we're going to have students whose background knowledge, which we should always tap into for new learning, most of their background knowledge might come in different ways, especially when learning something like math, which is numeracy. Numeracy is learned in different ways, just like languages are learned in different ways in different cultures. And it depending on the language system and code, it's also learned differently at different developmental stages. But I think the question about language and culture is one that I'm always surprised, to be honest, that the connection isn't just obvious to say that you can learn a language without knowing the culture, It's almost an impossibility for me in my brain. Everybody always asks me, like, I remember in my early years when I moved overseas, and people immediately assumed that I was from the United States, that I had grown up in the United States. And then I was like, why? Oh, because you're very American in your perspective and culture. Your accent is very American, American pop culture, all of these things. And I had never thought about myself in that way. That's just how I grew up. I grew up with being influenced by the American pop culture. And obviously, I grew up Guatemalan, so I knew both of those things existed in different parts of my identity, in different parts of my experiences, but all of them were me. Like I'm both of those things. My first international school posting was in Italy. So I was surprised how challenged culturally I was, that I thought I would go in and learn Italian very easily because I could speak two languages, and because Italian sound, everybody said, oh, Italian is a lot like Spanish. I think you're going to learn it really quickly. But the biggest block for me learning Italian, aside from my age, I was in my early 20s as well when I moved to Italy. But one of the blocks for me was cultural. There were a lot of things that culturally had not experienced and did not know about Italian culture. And that made it really hard for me to learn Italian. I moved to Northern Italy too, which I later found out, depending on where you are in different countries, not just in Italy, but in different countries. If you're in the North, or if you're in the South, or if you're in the center, there are different cultural expectations for language being used in those particular cases. So when I think about our students or our multilingual, and I love that you called it the environment, the ecosystem, I call it the multilingual ecology, which is like the whole like web of connection that exists in an international school community. But when I think about like my experiences with culture and learning a language. And I think about our students' experience as well of learning culture and learning language. When we think about the way curriculum is designed, curriculum will usually be designed based on the language that is being taught in. And so a lot of the cultural exposure that our students will get in international schools will come from, if its target language is English, it will come from English speaking culture background. So our students might have a hard time building that bridge if they don't have something to compare it with. Just like a celebration. Like, how do you celebrate birthdays? In some cultures, we don't celebrate birthdays. Whereas in cultures where English is spoken, usually birthdays are a big deal. So what does that mean for students? Do you have to celebrate birthday because you're learning in this language? Or can I say, this is the way that we view birthdays? This is the way that we view this celebration. And can that be part of the conversation around a belonging in a classroom or belonging in a community? And so I think that when a teacher, when a community, when a curriculum is culturally responsive, it doesn't mean that it has all of the cultures and it's designed based on all of the cultures. But curriculum, and like my good friend Dr. Darnell Fine will say, half the curriculum walks in when your students do. When a teacher is culturally responsive, it means that they are willing to respond within the curriculum that they're teaching and the delivery of the content to say, this is one perspective to look at this concept through. What other perspectives might there be to view this particular concept around? Again, inquiry, again, opening up to things that we might not know, which I know can put sometimes teachers in the place where you're a learner. You become a learner with your students in that moment. But I can't think of anything more beautiful. I can't think of any better way to model culturally responsive by just listening to others' perspectives and saying, my experiences were this. Sounds like your experiences were different. Tell us more. And how can we relate to this concept that we're learning so we can all understand it at a deeper level?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the whole piece, Darnell's quote there about the curriculum walking into the room and beginning with the students is so important. We can't do international education the way it was done. Certainly when I was a student in an international school back in the 80s and 90s, right, where,
Right.
it was more or less a copy paste, right, of,
Yeah.
a foreign curriculum. And the assumption was that the students were expat kids.
Yep.
And so, there was, I mean, the assumption was you were bundling the culture and the language, right?
Right.
And I think now it is way more complicated. You look at
For sure.
schools in mainland China, right, where they're running, foreign curriculum
Mm-hmm.
in English or sometimes multilingual,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to do host country
Absolutely.
curriculum as well,
Yeah.
right, and culture. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's just that's a very complicated thing to figure out, I
For
think, and
sure.
do well. But the potential for it is actually quite profound, I think, in terms of developing these global citizens in a much more, I don't know, intentional
Yeah.
and powerful way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that
Yeah.
now the world that our students are growing up in, I think that the exposure that they have to like when we compare our schooling with their schooling, it's true. Ours was very copy paste. Our teachers did what they were told, what they had. Right now, as teachers, we are handed so much that for us, that it's even overwhelming to think about where to start. And this is when I go back to that centering of the humans in the room, right? Because our students are also growing up in a world where they are getting information overload. They are getting exposure overload. There are things that developmentally they might not be ready to understand in certain ways. So they understand it in one way. And I really do think that us as teachers it's part of our role to build dialogues for understanding and dialogues for inquiry and opening up and saying, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's have it. What do you think about what surfaces for you when you look at a video like this, or students coming up with their own language that they share, and we're like, oh, that's so annoying. And then also like the incredible thing that kids are interconnected in a way that they can create their own language. We never got to experience that when we were younger. There is another entry point there. What is the opportunity we're missing when our students are so willing to lean into a language of connection? As silly as it sounds to us, what opportunities can there be then for us to build bridges of empathy and connectivity with the rest of the world that may have not existed before? And that's at the heart of innovation, right? To really look at the redefinition of what something can be, not the way that we learned it, not the way that our comfort zone tells us this is the way, this is the only way, but rather how can we open up to have our multilingual learners, multicultural learners, have more agency with their experiences and have guides and people who care about them, adults who care about them, that can guide them in the right thinking or in the right approach.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the undercurrent of everything we're saying here is that the domain of language is not something which is strictly speaking in language classrooms, right? It's in every classroom, right? Because we're using language everywhere. Culture is reproducing
That's
everywhere.
right.
So it's every teacher's responsibility. It's every leader's responsibility. And we have these people in schools, language specialists. We have consultants like yourself that are working with many schools. How can schools or individual teachers partner with and leverage the expertise of the language specialists that they have in their schools, or the consultants that they might bring in to really improve what they're doing in their particular domain?
I mentioned Dr. Hannesfeld's work before. I think that collaborative structures and intentional collaborative structures, I think, are very important to look within the multilingual ecology of each international school, because when we talked about the entry points of opportunity, I think collaboration in and of itself is finding the entry points to see who else can be involved in the co-design of learning experiences for our students that are long lasting, not that are for a test or that are for one specific experience, but that are really enduring learnings and understandings around any concept, language, numeracy skills, science, robotics, whatever it is, because all teachers do teach through language. Not everybody might be a skilled language teacher that can teach grammar, but we all teach through language. And this was actually said in one of Dr. Rojas's latest articles at the TIE, which is an amazing article around when she mentions around teachers teaching through language and how important the language that we use and the opportunities that we create for those languages are for learning of our students. But collaborative structures are definitely something to look at when you're looking at internally in what do we have already and who could be involved around the table that we can create. Now, obviously looking for consultants and looking for people that can guide this dialogue as well, having an outside facilitator that might be able to look at the entry points for you. Sometimes when we are working within a system, it's hard for us to look at what are the gaps of our system, what is the question we're not asking, what are the points, what are our peripherals not allowing us to see because we're so in it, right? And I think consultants that do this kind of work, that take a step back and fishbowl or audit systems or take a look or ask the questions around collaboration and gather data for schools, for either for a strategic plan that is going to build for sustainability when our multilingual populations are undeniably the biggest population of our schools, and also building that teacher capacity around collaboration, around instructional practices that support multilingual learners specifically because of the way that bilingual and multilingual brains work, translanguaging pedagogy being one of them. So I think that looking internally is like you would in your classroom. Sometimes you just have to take a walk around your classroom and see what's on the walls. What am I missing? What do I need? Who are my students? What languages do they bring that is not on the system of, oh, what's your home language? And somebody wrote it and put it down in a list. But what languages do you leverage? How do you leverage when you're playing outside with your friends? What are you languaging? When you're doing math in your brain, what language pops up for you first? What is all of these questions, having that data that can direct that community in your classroom to be more conducive to the multilingual learner experience. And then if you start looking at the layers and now the teachers, who are the teachers that are around? Who has this expertise? How can we leverage that? Who can help us co-construct this unit that has predominantly emergent bilinguals in our classroom? And then looking even more like in our leadership, who in our leadership holds this? Who can help us come and do an observation and tell us where are the pieces that we need to move in order to make this collaboration more effective? And so I think that centering that multilingual ecology and saying the decisions that we're going to make are going to see how we can move this forward together, I think that is a good kind of first step to leveraging the people, the humans, both internally and externally.
Wonderful. Yeah, you talked a bit about doing audits for
Yeah.
schools, and I've referenced your work as a consultant. And I know a lot of the listeners to this program and the people in the 21st century learning community in general are leaders within their own schools,
Yeah.
whatever they're doing. A lot of people are interested in exploring being a consultant. I get a lot of questions from people all the time about this. So when I'm talking with someone like yourself that's stepped into this world successfully, I always like to pick your brain a little bit and help our audience
Yeah.
around how do you successfully transition. Well, you haven't transitioned, you're still full-time in a wonderful school,
Yeah.
but how do you step into that world of consulting? What recommendations would you have?
Such a phenomenal question. And I actually had to think about this one, Justin, because I think it all boils down to mentors and building a community around yourself that mirrors you and mirrors you in a healthy way. People that can see sometimes the capacity that you might have that you can't see yourself. I always tell my friends, my really good friends, that I wish they could see themselves through my eyes. So I want also people to see me through their eyes and tell me and point out the things that they think would be something beneficial that if we're given a voice or a platform. So mentors as well, models in our lives, even as adults. And sometimes it can be people that are younger than us. Like our kids can be our models, our students can be our mentors. And so I think that for me is the first step. I think there's always this tug and pull around a consultancy job, doing it full time or not. And I think that also depends on the kind of person that you are. For me, for example, I am somebody who really thrives within a community. And so being a consultant partially and having to support other schools while centering the community that I work with, I think for me, that's my balance. That is where I can find the most success because that's for me, that's my style. So knowing who you want to be also as a consultant, as a voice, our voices have power, and the more exposure that we have, the more our voice holds power, and there's a huge responsibility to that. And so I think that also knowing yourself and your own boundaries as what you can do versus what you aspire to do, and surrounding yourself with people who not only believe in you, who not only who trust you, but that also are able to mentor you and say, that you can always go to and say, I'm having this dilemma. Because consultancy can sometimes be lonely as well. So for those of you looking to getting into that work, it can be lonely. Sometimes you can be in your own head. So having those people, those humans that remind you of who you are and can also say, hey, listen, consider this too. And that's where that community comes from. And I wouldn't want to give that up. I wouldn't want to not have that as a consultant, but I also understand that not everybody has the opportunity to be able to do both. I am very lucky and very privileged that I have the support to be able to do both.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I miss being in a school sometimes for sure, not and having that day-to-day community and also the ability to do what you do, right? And be
Yes.
able to
Yes.
kind of practice it real time as
Yes.
opposed to, purely kind of advising others or being at a place for just a couple of days
Yeah.
or what have you. So, that's very, very helpful.
Mhm.
Thank you for that, Ceci.
Yeah, I do want to say one thing though. I do want to say that, Justin, you've been one of those people for me. I just want to put it out there because I also feel like when you have people around you that build you up, or that, what's the saying, mention your name in a room full of opportunities. I think that's such a beautiful thing. I would say that becoming that person as well is important. So once you have had those mentors, that community supporting you, you pay it forward and you do the same for others. And I think that's also that I want to leave in this space. And I want to say, if anybody is looking for support or advice or a mentor, please do reach out to me. And if it's not me, I might be able to direct you to people, because I wish I would have had that at the beginning, at the very beginning, that I could have known who to reach out to. And I just want to put that out there so that if anybody wants to, please just reach out to me as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Absolutely. I think your point about mentors is so true. And sometimes mentors don't just magically appear. You need to actually find them,
Yeah.
right? And I think most people don't realize actually most people are willing to have a chat, right?
Yeah,
And quite open to it. And like you say, the loneliness piece is real, right?
it
And
is.
so having people reach out and and give feedback or ask questions, I think is most people are quite willing to do that and pay it forward, as you say.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting close to the 45-minute mark here. So I wanted to ask, because we have to ask about AI. It's mandatory to do that in this day and age. And obviously, technology, the power of technology and multilingualism, I mean, you can speak for hours around that. But I wondered if you could just share a couple of tools or interesting things you've discovered recently around multilingualism that can support that in schools or support your work.
Yeah, AI is completely transforming the way multilingual learners in the whole world to have access
Mm.
to understanding or language. Or it's a hugely loaded question, because the answer is, of course, yes, it's a transformation, and definitely language barriers are becoming less common when it comes to being able to use AI tools. I am a big fan of both Poe and Gemini. I use them all the time, even for my own like brainstorming, and even when I have to write a message in Guatemalan Spanish to help me wire my brain, because mostly my brain is. But if I have to write to like my bank or something in Guatemala, I know I want to use the appropriate language. So I do use AI for that, to make sure that the message is getting across well. And I think that with AI tools, it's not necessarily the tool, but of course, and I'm going to say this, I think I'm going to sound like a broken record for everybody who's saying this. And I think a lot of educators are saying this, but it is really the way that we leverage it and that we teach people to leverage it. And I'm not going to get on some sandbox about whether we should be afraid of it or not. What I have seen is that when multilingual learners leverage it to understand deeper concepts around very rigorous curriculum in academic content, it's wonderful, because they are able to not just translate. Remember, translanguaging, translating are two very different things. And what translating tools used to do for us was linearly translate one language to the other, which created a lot of confusion. But AI is able to translanguage, which means it's able to take the context, the cultural context, and academic context of language. And so it's really supporting some students who are emergent bilinguals in an IB program. studying in an overseas school and they need to really they really need to understand the content of something. Now, having said all of that, I think that the importance of us as educators to support that process for our learners and teach them how to leverage it. I think that's a part that we're also I'm learning, but I love to share what I'm learning. I love to share to say this really worked for me and it worked for me in this way. And I think it could really help you as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's really needed now, right? More than ever with AI, because it is changing so quickly day by day. We
Absolutely.
need to be
Yeah.
constantly sharing and
Mhm.
giving everyone the most up to date, information that's out there, right?
For
About how
sure.
you can leverage it well or be cautious about it on the other side of things.
For sure.
Okay, so last question is, you're doing the hard work day to day in a school and working with schools, but if you could wave your magic wand and make an immediate change to the way schools do things around language development,
Mm.
multilingualism, what would it be?
Wow. Um, I think that I would involve students more in their understanding of their own multilingualism. I think that there should be a specific standard or a specific not I don't even want to say assessment practice, but a specific recurring reflective process for our students to think of themselves as multilingual and multicultural within the systems of international schools and seeing how that impacts them as learning. So that student voice piece, I wish that I could wave a magic wand and actually come up with the idea of how to be able to do that for specifically for multicultural, multilingual students in international schools and have them be more aware of that so that they can feel completely whole in our spaces without having to think that they have to be different people in assimilation more so than being their whole selves. And how does that work towards my learning and understanding?
Well, that's wonderful. I think that's a wonderful way to end. I think if it was easy, we'd all be doing it already.
Absolutely.
But if there's one person that I can think of that might be able to come up with it, it would be you, Ceci. So really
Thank
appreciate you
you.
giving me so much time today. So have a great one
Thank you.
and hopefully see you soon in
Yes.
person.